We are still on Unit 2, where we're learning about informative writing skills. This lesson is going to focus on strategies that we use with informative paragraphs and then transitions between paragraphs. I want you to think back to Lesson 1, where we learned about the primacy and recency effect. And just for a refresher, when humans learn information, maybe something's being presented to them or they're reading something, they'll often remember the beginning the most and the end the most. These parts in the middle are often things that get forgotten. Um, and I want you to think about that with this question. I want you to pick one of these. The primacy recency effect tells us that we should share information in shorter or longer pieces. Which one do you think that would be? Well, the answer would be we want to do shorter pieces. Let me give you an example here with a longer segment. When you have longer pieces or segments, there's usually means you're going to have a longer middle. That means that people aren't going to remember as much, or their details are just going to get lost. And maybe you've seen this before. Maybe you've read something where it's just a big, long paragraph. And that happens in middle school quite often, where someone just forgets to break their writing into paragraphs, and it's just a very big, long piece of information. It's easy to forget the stuff in the middle when it's shared that way. However, when we break down our writing into smaller segments, maybe this gets broken down into smaller pieces, then we remember a lot more. The reason being, by the time we would get to the middle, we're already kind of finishing up that little piece. And there's never really a chance to get to that middle part where we forget. So you have a bunch of smaller pieces that all are kind of have small beginnings and endings, but not a lot of middle because they're all broken up with beginnings and endings throughout. The first breakdown I'm going to teach you about, where you're going to break your writing into smaller pieces, is headers. Headers are like the biggest pieces that you're going to be breaking your paper into. So going back to my example from earlier lessons of Washington crossing the Delaware, that's my big topic, right? But I want to break Washington crossing the Delaware into maybe 3 smaller topics. That way it's not just one big giant topic in my paper. Well, what would those 3 topics be? Well, doing some thinking ahead, I've come up with 3. The first topic is going to deal with America's bad situation before Washington crossed the Delaware. And when you have a header, you're going to usually have paragraphs that go with the header. So maybe I'll have 2 paragraphs that talk about America's bad situation. Another header that I would use would be just when Washington did cross the Delaware. I'll call it Washington's gamble, because it was definitely a big risk. And for that header, maybe I have 3 paragraphs that go with that one. My third header then over here would be when the British counterattacked after Washington secured the victory. And for that header, I maybe have 3 different paragraphs that go into that one. So you see how these headers help me break my big topic down into smaller topics here that are going to make sense to my audience. I want you to see this also in just some good pieces of writing as well. So the headers are really serving 2 purposes here. They first show how paragraphs are connected. For example, these 3 paragraphs here are all about Washington's gamble when he took the risk to cross the Delaware. So that's what that header does. It shows how they all belong to that topic. And then it divides your writing into shorter segments. Like I said, instead of having 1 segment, now we have 3. So I'd like you to go to these articles. You can go to the presentation and click on these links here. You see how this is a clickable link. I'd like you to write down on your sheets, how do these writing pieces break down into headers? Could you please write down the names of the headers from the writing pieces? Then we'll talk about it a little more when we meet for our discussion. Here's a common header mistake I would like to help you avoid. A lot of times students think, oh, I really want to have headers in my writing, but then they only have 1 paragraph per header. So they're pretty much just paragraph titles. They're not really showing how multiple paragraphs are connected. And this is just kind of what that looks like. So here we have a header, but only 1 paragraph that goes under the header. Here we have another header, just 1 paragraph. Another header, 1 paragraph, another header, 1 paragraph. So we see that these are pretty much just paragraph titles. They're not headers that bring multiple paragraphs together. So just remember, headers are supposed to show how multiple paragraphs fit together. They're not meant to be paragraph titles. Speaking of paragraphs, that's kind of our second breakdown here. So once we've broken down our paper into 3 different topics or headers, then we can decide what kind of paragraphs do we want. And it's nice to do that by header. So let's say I'm talking about America's bad situation. I've decided to do 2 paragraphs for that header. One where it talks about how the Americans lose New York in a battle to the British, and another paragraph how many American soldiers were leaving or deserting. Both of these have to do with this header topic here. When I do Washington's Gamble, I'm going to have 3 paragraphs. I'm going to talk about how they crossed the river during the middle of the night. I'll talk about the marching of the 9 miles. Then I'll talk about the battle itself once they finally get there. When I do the British counterattack, I'm going to break that down into 2 different paragraphs. So how should we write these paragraphs? When we write informative paragraphs, there is a style that usually works well. Your paragraph should stay only to one topic, so like a topic like this or a topic like that, and obviously should fit under your header topic. And that topic should have a topic sentence where you're really saying what your topic of your paragraph is. After that, you should have evidence, details, and examples to prove your topic or to show your topic. Then once you do that, this is called personal analysis. This is where you're not just being a robot and basically copying and pasting information from elsewhere. You are also sharing what's inside your brain. What do you think about what you're writing? That adds your voice and style into whatever piece you're putting together. Here's an example of that where I write a paragraph on how the Americans lose New York in a battle to the British. So my topic sentence would be, the biggest reason things looked bleak for America is how their last battle went in New York. So there's my topic. I'm going to talk about how we lost the Battle of New York. My evidence and details. So these are just things that show how we lost the Battle of New York. So I would call these examples and details. General Howe and the British Army invaded the city and immediately drove the Americans from the battlefield. The Americans looked lost against their professional and organized British soldiers. They lost so quickly that the Americans even had to surrender at Fort Washington on the Hudson River. Over 2,800 Americans became prisoners when this happened. So basically I just wrote 4 sentences, and they all are just little details that show that New York did not go well. They lost that Battle of New York. But then I'm not done. A lot of people do stop here and they just list some facts and call it a day. But you need to also share what you think about this. Make this paper your own. So my little thought at the end is, as the Americans went to their winter quarters, even Washington must have wondered if the revolution was on the verge of collapsing. So as I'm thinking, I try to get into Washington's head. I imagine even the leader of the American troops, if you're going to be experiencing something like this, that's got to make you think that if this is not going well, what if we're going to lose? Let's give you another example with this paragraph this time. Many American soldiers are leaving or deserting the army. So my topic sentence for this one was, not only was Washington losing battles, but he was also losing his men. And my details and examples, my evidence, most of Washington's men signed up for only 1 year. That's a detail. Once January 1st came, these men would be free to go home, and Washington would have no army. Many men didn't even wait for January 1st to leave. After their loss in New York, many soldiers gave up and escaped from the army at night. So those are some examples of why many American soldiers were leaving, or just showing that many American soldiers were leaving. And this still, just to point out, has to do with America's bad situation. The paragraphs need to match the header. Now, I'm still not done, right? I need to provide my personal analysis. So what are my personal thoughts? Well, my thoughts to this is, with his army about to wither away, Washington and the Americans were in a desperate situation. They needed a big victory or something to turn the momentum of the war. So those are my thoughts. A victory would really help this situation where people are leaving and they're losing other battles. So hopefully these examples gave you an idea of how your paragraph should be fitting with your headers and then also the structure that your paragraph should have. Let's talk about connecting your paragraphs now, and we do that with things called transitions. For example, when I wrote this paragraph and this paragraph, I want to show how these paragraphs are related to each other. You can do that by using a transition. Same thing with these paragraphs over here that are all under this header. I need to have transitions that connect these two together and show how they're related, and also a transition to show how these paragraphs are related. Same thing over here. We need a transition. So why do we need transitions? Well, we want to show how our paragraphs are related to each other. Why is that? It just helps the human brain understand when we read. When we can see how things connect and how things fit together like a puzzle, we get the picture a lot more. When you look at 1,000 random puzzle pieces, it's not going to make a whole lot of sense to you. But when you see it as one big picture that is all connected together, that's going to make our brains remember. You might have learned a lot of these popular transition words in earlier grades, and these work. You can write these words at the beginning of your paragraphs. I think we're ready to move on past this a little more. This is just a little bit simple, and it kind of reads like a student's writing. To get a little more professional with our transitions, we're going to write transition sentences, which tie the two paragraphs together. So when you have paragraph 1 and paragraph 2, for example, this sentence should be bridging and showing how they're connected. There's two spots where you can do this. The first spot is to have your transition sentence at the end of your first paragraph, kind of previewing what's going to happen over in the next paragraph. Your other option is to have your transition at the beginning of your next paragraph and then just kind of refer to the last paragraph. Let me give you a couple examples of these. So going back to the paragraphs that I wrote, I'm just going to show the topic sentence here. That first paragraph was about the Americans losing New York in a battle to the British, right? This is about America's bad situation. The other paragraph that I write is that many American soldiers are leaving or deserting. How can I tie those things together? Well, here's what I did. So at the beginning of my next paragraph, I say, not only was Washington losing battles, but he was also losing men. Do you see what I did there? I'm referring, kind of subtly, to the last paragraph, because the last paragraph was all about how Washington lost that Battle of New York. So now I kind of bring that up here, but then tie it together with what I'm going to talk about next, how he's losing his men. Let's look at another example. So looking at these two paragraphs here, this paragraph talks about how the Washington's men had to march 9 miles in the blowing snow to Trenton. The other paragraph talks about how Washington had to cross the Delaware River in the middle of the night in December. So at the end of this paragraph, I can preview this paragraph, and here's how I did that. So I'm kind of finishing my paragraph here. At 2:30 a.m., the last boat finally made it across the icy river. My analysis: they were short on time and cold. Here's my preview. However, if the soldiers thought the crossing was hard, their next task proved to be even more miserable. And that kind of gets them thinking, oh, what's their next task? How is it more miserable? And here's my next paragraph now. Washington's men now had to march 9 miles in the blowing snow to get to their enemy. They only had 4 hours to get there before daylight. So this preview here really shows how these two paragraphs are related. They're both just about really tough things that the soldiers had to endure. I'd like you now to practice this transition. So we're going to the difficulties at Valley Forge. If you remember, that's where Washington and his men were stuck during a winter. There was very little food, clothing, shelter. It was just a difficult situation for the people fighting for the American side. I'm going to give you two paragraphs, and it's kind of up to you where you want this transition to be. So the first paragraph is about shoes. The few shoes that existed at camp were often missing soles. Frostbite can probably even make the bravest soldiers wonder why they are fighting. The next paragraph is about food then. So food was very difficult to come by during the Valley Forge winter. Many farmers refused to sell food to the Continental Army because the Continental dollars were worthless. I'd like you to pause the video, and I would like you to think about how could you write a transition statement either here where you're previewing this paragraph, or here where you kind of refer to this paragraph. So write a transition statement either at the end of the first paragraph or at the beginning of the next paragraph. Take a moment to pause this video and get that done, and you'll show this to me next time we meet. All right, moving on to our final slide. I just want to show you how this lesson relates to your scoring for informative writing. And that'll fit in these two rubric rows, the organization of your topics and paragraphs, and then transitions and headings. By the end of the year, remember this is a goal for the end of the year, I want you to be able to use paragraphs that have one topic each. These paragraphs use topic sentences, details, and personal analysis. I also want you to be able to use transition statements or sentences to connect paragraphs and ideas together. And I also want you to be able to use headings to unify multiple paragraphs into an overarching topic. So whenever you put a writing piece together, you'll be scored in that way, and that's how we'll get better as a writer.